I am Joshua, 32, and my own father slid an eviction notice across my Thanksgiving table to kick me out of my own house. Before I tell you about how my best friend's envelope completely destroyed his plan and left him with nothing, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. The eviction notice landed right beside the mashed potatoes. It wasn't a metaphor. It wasn't a joke. My father, Robert, actually slid a crisp, cream-colored envelope across the polished oak wood of my dining table. It stopped right between the gravy boat and the green bean casserole my neighbor had brought over. My father leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms over his chest, and let out a long breath like he had just finished saying grace. I stared at the envelope. Across the top, printed in bold, aggressive black ink, were the words, "Notice to vacate and surrender possession." My mother smiled first. She didn't yell. She didn't shake with anger. She just gave me that small, tidy, closed-mouth smile that she always used when she was doing something incredibly cruel. It was her special talent, making absolute ruthlessness look like simple administration. 7 days, she said, her voice smooth and light, as if she were asking me to pass the salt. Your brother needs this house, Joshua. It's time to be reasonable. I looked across the table at my older brother, Luke. He was 35 years old, sitting there in a brand new designer shirt he definitely couldn't afford, picking at a piece of turkey. He didn't look embarrassed. He didn't look ashamed that his parents were trying to throw his younger brother out onto the street. He just looked relieved. He actually reached for his wine glass and took a sip, avoiding my eyes. That somehow made it so much worse. The sheer entitlement radiating from him made my stomach turn. I sat there, the carving knife still resting near my plate, and I just stared at the piece of paper. I didn't reach for it. I didn't touch it. You've had a good run here, Joshua, my mother continued, folding her linen napkin and placing it neatly on the table. But Luke needs a real start. He needs stability. This house can do that for him. You're single, you're adaptable. You can find a nice apartment downtown. I finally looked up from the paper. I looked at my father. By what authority? My dad tapped the top of the notice with one heavy index finger. Legal demand. You can either make this smooth, or you can make it expensive. Your choice. The sheer audacity of it left a ringing in my ears. The dining room, usually filled with the warm scent of roasted turkey and cinnamon apple pie, suddenly felt like a freezing interrogation room. They were sitting in the chairs I bought, eating the food I cooked, in the house I owned, telling me to get out. I picked the paper up. My eyes scanned the text. It was dressed up to sound incredibly official. It was full of heavy legal jargon, phrases like adverse occupancy, family equitable interest, and surrender of premises to rightful beneficiary. It looked intimidating. It was printed on thick, expensive watermark paper. But I noticed something immediately. There was no court stamp. There was no judge's signature. It was a lawyer's threat letter, dressed up in a Halloween costume of a real court order. Luke leaned back, mirroring my father's posture. You live alone, man. I've got actual needs. I'm trying to get my life together. You're just being selfish, hoarding this whole place to yourself. I let out a harsh, dry laugh. Couldn't help it. The sound bounced off the walls of the dining room. Hoarding? I own this house, Luke. My mother's smile vanished. Your grandfather was being dramatic when he deeded it to you. We all know that. He was emotional. He wasn't thinking clearly about the family's future. My father reached for his wine. The lawyer we retained believes Luke has a highly viable claim. Owen intended this property to stay in the direct family line. You're just a branch, Joshua. I am the direct family line, I said, my voice dropping an octave. Luke snorted. You know what he means. Yeah. I knew exactly what he meant. He meant the favorite. He meant the golden boy. He meant the son my parents had spent their entire lives making excuses for. You served me at Thanksgiving, I said, dropping the paper back onto the table. My father shrugged, cutting a piece of meat. I figured if we did it face to face, surrounded by family, you might behave like an adult and accept reality. I opened my mouth to tell him exactly where he could shove his reality, but the doorbell rang. 3 sharp, quick rings. Nobody moved. The silence in the room was deafening. Then the bell rang again. I pushed my chair back. It scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. I walked down the front hall, my heart hammering against my ribs, and opened the door. Standing on my porch in the brisk November air was my next-door neighbor and absolute best friend, Elijah. He was holding a pie carrier in his left hand, and in his right hand he held a thick, sealed legal envelope. Elijah worked as a senior paralegal at a prominent downtown estate firm. More importantly, he was one of the only people in the world who knew that my father had been making shady phone calls to local real estate attorneys for the past 3 weeks. He looked past my shoulder, saw the tension radiating from the dining room, and looked back at my face. He knew immediately. "So," Elijah said softly, his eyes narrowing, "they actually did it." I nodded once. "All right then," Elijah said, his voice turning cold and professional. "Let's go." To understand the absolute insanity of what was happening at my dining table, you have to go back 6 years. You have to understand the ghosts that lived in the walls of this house, and the shadows my family cast over my entire life. 6 years ago, my grandfather, Owen, passed away. But for the 3 years before his death, this house was a hospital, a sanctuary, and a war zone. And I was the only one holding the front line. Grandpa Owen was a tough, quiet man who built a successful hardware business from nothing. When his heart started failing, my parents suddenly became very busy. My father, Robert, claimed his middle management job was too demanding. My mother suddenly had endless social club obligations. And Luke was busy burning through his college fund, dropping out of his 3rd university program, and racking up credit card debt. So I stepped up. I was 26, working a grueling entry-level corporate job, but I moved in with Grandpa. I was the one who woke up at 3 a.m. when he couldn't breathe. I was the one who drove him to endless cardiology appointments, sitting in sterile waiting rooms reading old magazines. When the back porch started sagging dangerously, I didn't call my dad to help. I took a chunk out of my own salary, bought the lumber, and spent my entire weekend replacing the joists while Grandpa sat in a lawn chair, watching me and giving me quiet advice. During all this, Luke treated the house like a free ATM and a hotel. He would show up unannounced, raid the fridge, and ask Grandpa for loans that everyone knew would never be repaid. One Thanksgiving, 4 years before the current nightmare, Luke showed up in a panic. He had wrecked his car, a car my parents had co-signed for. He begged Grandpa for $5,000 to cover the damages before our parents found out. Grandpa refused. He told Luke it was time to take responsibility. Luke threw an absolute fit. He screamed, kicked a hole in the hallway drywall, and stormed out. I spent the next evening patching and painting that wall. When my parents found out about the car, they didn't discipline Luke. They blamed Grandpa for being too rigid, and actually had the nerve to ask me why I didn't just give Luke the money from my own savings. "He's your brother Joshua?" My mother had sighed, looking at me like I was a disappointment. "You need to support him. He's just going through a rough patch." Luke's rough patches lasted decades. He stole money from my wallet when we were teenagers. He once intentionally ruined a presentation I had built for school because he was jealous I was getting academic recognition. And my parents always had a reason ready. He was stressed. He was sensitive. I was just being dramatic. They spent my entire life preparing the world to cushion Luke's falls, and they expected me to be the mattress. But Grandpa Owen saw everything. He sat in his armchair in the corner of the living room, his oxygen tank humming quietly, and he watched the dynamic. He watched Luke borrow his truck and return it with a cracked windshield, offering zero apologies. He watched my mother reframe every single sacrifice I made for him as just Joshua doing his duty. He watched my father hint, loudly, that the house would be a great asset for Luke to inherit because Luke needed a solid foundation to start a family. Grandpa never argued with them. He never yelled. He just asked me quiet questions when we were alone. He asked about my job. He asked about my savings. He asked if I liked the old house. I loved this house. It smelled like old wood, pine needles, and lemon polish. It was the only place I ever felt truly safe. Good, Grandpa had said one evening, staring out the window at the falling snow. That's good to know, Joshua. I didn't know it then, but behind the scenes, Grandpa was making moves. He was a man who believed in actions, not arguments. He saw the storm that was coming for me the moment he closed his eyes for the last time. He knew that the second his heart stopped, my parents and Luke would descend on this house like vultures, and they would push me out into the cold without a second thought. So he decided to build a fortress around me. He didn't tell me. He definitely didn't tell my parents. He just quietly picked up his phone, called his attorney, and started drafting the legal equivalent of a landmine. Grandpa Owen's lawyer was a man named Caleb Mercer. Caleb wasn't a cheap strip mall attorney. He was a high-end estate planner, a man who built legal structures that could withstand a nuclear blast. In the final year of his life, Grandpa took several trips to Caleb's downtown office. He told my parents he was going to physical therapy. Instead, he was sitting in a leather chair in a high-rise building, legally dismembering my family's sense of entitlement. Grandpa executed a transfer on death deed for the house. It was incredibly specific. The deed stated that upon his passing, the absolute, unencumbered ownership of the property in Asheville would transfer directly and solely to me, not to my parents, not split evenly between the grandchildren, just me. He made sure the deed was recorded and filed properly with the county clerk months before he ever took to his deathbed. But Grandpa was a smart man. He knew my father. He knew Robert would not accept a piece of paper. He knew my father would hire lawyers, tie the estate up in probate hell, and financially bleed me dry until I surrendered the house just to make the nightmare stop. So Grandpa and Caleb Mercer went a step further. They created the trap. Grandpa had a separate investment portfolio. It wasn't billionaire money, but it was a substantial amount, roughly $240,000. This money was placed into a residual trust. The designated beneficiaries of this trust were my father, my mother, and Luke. It was designed to pay out to them in installments over several years. To my parents, this was their rightful inheritance. They felt they were owed this money simply for existing. But Grandpa attached a condition to the trust. Poison pill. Caleb drafted an incredibly aggressive no contest and forfeiture clause. The language was ironclad. It stated in very clear legal terms that if any of the trust beneficiaries, Robert, my mother, or Luke, attempted to challenge my title to the house, interfered with my peaceful possession of the property, or assisted anyone else in asserting a false claim against the house, they would instantly trigger a forfeiture event. If they tried to take the house, they would lose every single penny of the trust money. And to make it stick, Caleb made my father sign a sworn family settlement and non-contest acknowledgement during the probate period. My father, blinded by the promise of the trust payouts, signed it. He signed a legal document acknowledging that I was the sole lawful owner of the house, and he agreed to the penalty clause. I didn't know the full extent of this paperwork at the time. Grandpa passed away quietly on a Tuesday morning. I was holding his hand. My parents were on a weekend getaway they refused to cancel. When Grandpa died, the deed triggered automatically. The house became mine. I remember the day of the funeral. It was pouring rain. The sky was the color of bruised iron. We stood under black umbrellas by the gravesite. Luke was complaining about his dress shoes getting muddy. My mother was whispering to her friends about how exhausted she was from the ordeal of losing her father-in-law. My father just looked impatient. After the service, I went back to the empty house. Felt hollow. I sat on the floor of the living room and cried until my ribs ached. I had lost the only person in my family who actually saw me. The next few years were a grind. I got a promotion at work, which was lucky, because the house needed serious help. I poured every extra dollar of my salary into this place. When the furnace completely died in the middle of a brutal January freeze, I worked double shifts, taking on every grueling project my boss threw at me, just to afford a replacement. I spent my nights ripping up old carpet, sanding down the original hardwood floors until my hands bled, and fighting with city clerks to update old permit records. Through all of this, my parents didn't lift a single finger. They never offered to help paint. They never chipped in for the property taxes. They never even asked how I was managing. To them, the house was my burden. Until the neighborhood started to change. About 3 years after Grandpa died, the city of Asheville exploded in popularity. Developers moved in. Coffee shops and boutique stores opened up 3 blocks away. Suddenly, the quiet, run-down street Grandpa had lived on was the hottest zip code in the county. I was sitting on my porch one afternoon when a real estate agent knocked on my door and casually offered me $600,000 in cash for the property. I declined, of course. This was my home. But word travels fast in my family. Suddenly, my parents were very interested in Joshua's house. It started with subtle comments. My father would come over for a forced Sunday dinner, look around at the newly refinished floors and say, "You know, this is a lot of space for one guy. You're sitting on a gold mine, Josh. It's almost selfish not to leverage it." My mother would sigh and say, "Luke is struggling so much with his rent. It breaks my heart knowing there are 3 empty bedrooms just sitting here collecting dust." I set hard boundaries. I told them the house was mine, I wasn't selling, and Luke was not moving in. I knew exactly what would happen if Luke crossed my threshold with a suitcase. He would never leave, he would never pay rent, and he would slowly destroy everything I had built. That's when the whispering started. My father's brother, Uncle David, was going through a nasty divorce. He was bitter, angry at the world, and always looking for someone to blame. David became the poison in my father's ear. I heard them talking at a family barbecue. David told my father that it was a disgrace, that the youngest son was sitting in a $500,000 asset while the eldest son was struggling. He fed my father's ego, telling him that as the patriarch, Robert should have control over the family's legacy. "You let an old dying man make a mistake," David had sneered over a beer. "You need to fix it, Robert. Take the house back. Put it in a family trust where you control who lives there." My father absorbed this toxicity like a sponge. He started viewing my ownership of the house not as a legal fact, but as a temporary mistake that he needed to correct. But to execute his plan, he needed information. He needed to know my vulnerabilities. And that's where my cousin Julian came in. Julian was David's son. We used to be close when we were kids. I thought we still were. Julian would text me, asking to grab a beer, casually asking about my work schedule. "Man, you're always hustling," he'd say. "When do you actually get time off? You still working from home on Fridays?" I didn't think anything of it. I told him my schedule. I told him I had mandatory in-office meetings every Friday morning, and I usually stayed late on Wednesdays. I didn't realize Julian was taking mental notes and reporting straight back to my father and Luke. He was the spy inside my camp, mapping out my routines, finding the exact windows of time when the house would be empty and undefended. Things started getting weird a month before Thanksgiving. I come home from work and find small things out of place. The latch on the side gate was unlocked, even though I swore I secured it. The security light in the back alley had been unscrewed. A heavy ceramic pot on the front porch had been moved slightly to the left. I thought I was losing my mind. I thought I was just stressed from work. I mentioned it to Elijah one evening over a beer on his porch. Elijah didn't brush it off. His face got very serious. Because Elijah worked in real estate law, he knew the dirty tricks families played when millions of dollars were on the line. "Josh," Elijah had said, leaning forward, "people don't just unscrew security lights for fun. Someone is testing your perimeter. They're seeing how much you notice." A week later, Elijah pulled me aside as I was getting out of my car. He looked incredibly uncomfortable. "Listen, I shouldn't be telling you this because of professional courtesy, but one of the junior partners at my firm mentioned your dad's name today. Your dad called our office looking for a consultation on adverse family possession and equitable eviction." My blood ran cold. My own father was shopping around for lawyers to sue me for my own home. "If they try anything," Elijah had said, his eyes fierce, You let me know. I know exactly what kind of fire your grandpa built to burn them down. You just say the word. And now, sitting at my Thanksgiving table, looking at the fake eviction notice my father had just slid across the wood, I knew the time had come. Let's go back to the dining room. Elijah stepped fully into my house. He didn't take off his shoes. He walked right past the entryway, his eyes locked on the dining table. He set the pie carrier on the kitchen counter with a loud thud, then walked straight into the dining room. My father straightened up in his chair, his brow furrowing. Who is this, Joshua? We're having a private family discussion. This is my neighbor, I said, my voice steady, though my adrenaline was spiking so hard my hands felt numb. And my witness. Elijah stepped right up to the edge of the table. He didn't look at my mother, and he ignored Luke completely. He looked directly down at my father. He held out the sealed, thick legal envelope. This was left for Mr. Bennett at my firm's office today, Elijah said, his voice carrying the cold, practiced authority of a man who dealt with legal disputes every single day. Certified delivery. My father stared at the envelope. He didn't reach for it. What is this? What firm? My boss, Caleb Mercer, said you would want to read this tonight. Elijah continued, not answering the question. Especially if you actually went through with handing over that garbage notice you're holding. The mention of Caleb Mercer's name hit my father like a physical blow. I saw it happen. The muscles in his neck tightened, and his shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. Caleb was the architect of Grandpa's trust. Caleb was the man who held the keys to the $240,000 my parents were currently relying on to fund their retirement. My father slowly reached out and took the envelope. What is this? He asked again, his voice losing its confident edge. Open it, Elijah said simply. My father broke the seal. He pulled out a thick stack of papers stapled together at the corner. He unfolded them and began to read the first page. I watched his eyes. I watched them scan the first few lines, then slow down, then stop completely. The color drained from his face so rapidly it looked like a magic trick. His skin went from a healthy, wine-flushed pink to a sickly, chalky gray in 3 seconds flat. His mouth parted slightly. My mother turned to him, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere. Robert, what does it say? For the first time all evening, my father didn't look like the patriarch in control. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff in the dark. He looked caught. Luke leaned over, trying to see the paper. Dad, what is it? My father couldn't speak. His throat worked, but no sound came out. Elijah answered for him. It's a copy of your father's own sworn statement from the probate settlement, Elijah said, his voice ringing clearly through the quiet room. The exact document he signed under oath. The one where he explicitly admitted that Joshua was the sole lawful owner of this property. And the one where he legally agreed that any family member who tried to challenge Joshua's possession would instantly forfeit the rest of Owen's trust distribution. The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the carpet. My father read the page twice more before he finally found a weak, trembling voice. This doesn't mean what you think it means. This is just probate formality. It was such a pathetic, hollow lie that even my mother turned toward him, her eyes wide with sudden panic. Elijah didn't flinch. He reached out, placed his finger on the second paragraph of the document in my father's hand, and tapped it. It means exactly what it says, Robert. Caleb Mercer doesn't write formalities. He writes legal bear traps. I stood up at the head of my table. I picked up my fork, gripping the cold metal just to keep my hands from shaking with the sheer, overwhelming rush of adrenaline. Luke was practically out of his chair now, his face twisting in confusion and growing anger. What the hell are you talking about? What trust distribution? My mother went completely still. It was that dangerous, freezing stillness she adopted when she realized she was losing control of a narrative, and she had to decide whether to double down on the lie or retreat and play the victim. She chose to double down. Probate paperwork doesn't override family fairness, she snapped, glaring at Elijah. This is none of your business. This is an internal family matter. Elijah looked right back at her. It's a good thing this isn't about fairness, ma'am. It's about a legally binding forfeiture clause. Elijah pulled a second document from his jacket pocket. It was a single sheet of paper. He didn't hand it to my father. He bypassed him completely and slid it directly in front of Luke. It was a strategic move. Elijah knew that Luke only believed things when he read them himself. "Read the highlighted part, Luke," Elijah commanded. Luke stared at the paper. His eyes tracked the yellow highlighter ink. He read it out loud, his voice tight and incredulous. "Any beneficiary who directly or indirectly contests title, possession, or beneficial ownership of the Asheville residence transferred to Joshua Bennett, or supports another person in doing so, shall be deemed to have predeceased distribution under Article 6. Luke stopped. The room held its breath. Even someone as dense as my brother understood what that legal phrasing meant. He understood predeceased distribution. "You get nothing," I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "If you try to take this house, you lose every dime Grandpa left you." The reality of those words crashed over Luke like a tidal wave. Predeceased distribution. He dropped the paper onto the table as if it had caught fire. He looked at my father, his eyes wide with a frantic, wild energy. "Dad, is this real? Tell me this is fake. You told me the lawyer said we had an airtight case." My father pushed his chair back. The legs screeched against the hardwood. He stood up, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I manipulated him?" I asked, my voice deadly quiet. "I brainwashed him by changing his adult diapers while you were on a wine-tasting tour in Napa? I isolated him by being the only person who bothered to visit him in the cardiac ward while Luke was busy begging him for bail money." "That's a lie," Luke shouted, stepping toward me, his fists clenching. "It's the absolute truth, and you know it." I roared back, stepping out from behind the table to face him. "Grandpa saw exactly who you people are. He watched you borrow his truck and smash it. He watched Dad scheme. He watched Mom treat me like the hired help. He didn't write this clause because I manipulated him. He wrote it because he finally stopped making excuses for you." Luke slapped his hand down hard on the table, making the plates jump and silverware rattle. "So what? Grandpa just gets to decide I'm homeless forever because you played the good little martyr?" "You are not homeless, Luke," I yelled, the years of repressed anger finally exploding out of my chest. "You are 35 years old. You have been employed at 4 different companies in the last 3 years, and you quit all of them because you think you're too good for real work. You are not a victim. You are a parasite, and you are convinced that everyone else's roof is your birthright." Luke's face twisted into an ugly, hateful sneer. He took another step toward me, closing the distance. "This right here, this is exactly why he shouldn't have left you the place. You always act like you're better than everybody else. You're a smug, arrogant little prick." I said, pointing a finger right into the center of his chest. "Like the person who paid for the furnace, the property taxes, and the new roof after every single one of you disappeared when the work got hard." "You're being cruel, Joshua," my mother said, her voice shaking with forced victimhood. "Cruel." The word tasted like ash in my mouth. I looked at the Thanksgiving feast spread out on the table. The turkey I had roasted, the potatoes I had mashed. You sat at my table, ate my food, and smiled while my father handed me an eviction notice. And you have the absolute gall to call me cruel? Elijah stepped forward, positioning himself slightly between me and Luke. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out one final piece of paper. "This is the part your husband really needs to see, ma'am," Elijah said, not breaking eye contact with my mother. He placed the paper on the table, right on top of my father's plate. It was a formal notice of suspension from the trust administrator. It wasn't filed in court yet, but it was fully drafted, signed, and ready to be executed. Elijah spoke with crystal clarity. "This notice states that because Robert Bennett formally delivered an eviction demand tonight and asserted a claim against the deeded property, The trust administrator has the immediate authority to suspend all pending trust distributions. If you do not formally withdraw this fake eviction notice within 72 hours, Caleb Mercer will seek court instructions for the final, permanent enforcement of the forfeiture clause. My father looked down at the paper. He looked physically ill. The bravado, the arrogance, the patriarchal authority. It all melted away, replaced by the terrifying realization of absolute financial ruin. Luke saw his father's face. He saw the defeat, and because Luke only cared about himself, he instantly turned on the man who had been trying to steal a house for him. "Wait," Luke demanded, grabbing my father's arm. "How much are we talking about? How much is suspended?" Nobody answered. "Dad, how much?" Luke screamed. "Roughly $80,000 per beneficiary," Elijah answered calmly, "plus residual accounting." Luke went completely still. I could see the rusted gears turning in his head. The trust payout was his safety net. It was the money he was waiting for to pay off his debts. But the house was worth $600,000. I saw the exact moment Luke made the calculation. I saw the pure, unadulterated greed override basic common sense. Losing 80 grand hurt, but gaining a $600,000 asset. To a desperate, greedy man, that was a gamble worth taking. "Fine," Luke spat, his eyes locking onto mine with a terrifying, loose anger. "Keep the damn trust money. Grandpa got manipulated. I'm not backing off because you found some paralegal to wave scare papers in my face. If you step onto this property claiming possession," Elijah warned, his voice dropping low, "you will be arrested for trespassing." Luke just smiled. It was a bad smile, cold, familiar, and reckless. "We'll see what the sheriff calls it." Luke didn't wait for a response. He spun around, marched down the hallway, and slammed the front door so hard the glass panes rattled in their frames. My father let out a string of vicious curses under his breath. He glared at me, a look of pure, toxic hatred, then snatched the fake eviction notice off the table, as if removing the physical paper could erase the fact that he had crossed the point of no return. He turned and hurried after Luke. My mother hesitated. She looked at the ruined Thanksgiving dinner, then looked at me. She gathered her expensive wool coat, refusing to break eye contact. "You will regret making this so ugly, Joshua," she hissed. "I already regret unlocking the front door," I replied. She left, pulling the door shut sharply behind her. The house plunged into a sudden, ringing silence. The adrenaline that had been keeping me standing upright suddenly evaporated, leaving my knees weak. I slumped into the nearest chair, running my hands over my face. Elijah let out a massive exhale, leaning against the doorframe. "Holy hell, Josh, they actually tried it." "He's not done," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Did you see Luke's face? He did the math. He thinks the house is worth risking the trust money." "I know," Elijah said grimly, "and that's exactly why my boss is outside." I looked up, startled. "Caleb is here?" Before Elijah could answer, my phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from an unknown number. "This is Caleb Mercer with Heron and Rowe Trust Administration. I am parked on the street. Do not let them leave the area before I speak to your father." I jumped up, bypassed the dining room, and jogged out the front door. The freezing night air hit my face like a wet towel. Parked 2 houses down, under the glow of a street lamp, was a sleek black sedan. My parents and Luke were arguing furiously by my father's SUV. As I stepped onto the porch, the door of the black sedan opened. Caleb Mercer stepped out. He was a tall, imposing man in a dark wool trench coat, carrying a thick leather briefcase. He walked with the heavy, deliberate strides of a man who spent his life destroying people in courtrooms. He didn't look angry. He looked dangerously bored. He walked straight past me on the porch and headed directly for my father's SUV. "Robert Bennett," Caleb's voice boomed across the quiet suburban street. It wasn't a question. It was a summons. My father froze, his hand on the car door handle. He turned, his face pale under the streetlights. "Who the hell are you?" Caleb Mercer, Trust Administration Counsel for the Owen Bennett Estate. My father took a step back, physically retreating from the name. Caleb didn't stop until he was standing 3 feet away from my father. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It wasn't the forfeiture notice. It was something else. I want to make sure we are entirely clear on the timeline of your catastrophic mistakes tonight. Robert, Caleb said, his voice smooth but lethal. You thought this was a private family matter. It stopped being private the second you sent this to my office. Caleb held up the paper. Even from the porch, I could see it was a printed email. 2 days ago, Caleb continued, my office received an email from your personal account. Attached to it was a document titled Joshua Transition Agreement. In this document, it states that Joshua Bennett has agreed in principle to surrender occupancy of the Asheville residence to Luke Bennett by the end of the calendar year. My heart stopped. I looked at Elijah, who was standing beside me on the porch. I never signed anything, I said loudly. I know you didn't, Caleb said, glancing at me before turning his piercing gaze back to my father. Because the signature on the document Robert sent us was a pathetic amateur forgery. The signature discrepancy was obvious to a first-year clerk. The problem for you, Robert, is that you sent a forged legal document to a trust office that keeps specimen signatures from the original probate settlement on file. My mother grabbed her chest, letting out a small gasp. She turned to my father, genuine shock on her face. Robert, you forged his signature? My father's mouth opened and closed like a dying fish. It was a draft understanding. Proposal. I was going to show it to him tonight. You sent it to the trust administrator to establish a false record of consent, Caleb countered effortlessly. That is fraud, Robert. And it is a direct, undeniable violation of the non-contest clause. Luke rounded on my father, his face purple with rage. You told me he had already softened up. You told me you had an agreement in principle. I said he might agree. My father snapped back, panic making his voice crack. You lied to your son, you lied to your wife, and you attempted to defraud a trust, Caleb summarized coldly. The forfeiture is no longer a threat. It is in motion. All pending distributions under Owen Bennett's residual trust are suspended effective immediately. The reality of the situation finally seemed to crush my father. He leaned heavily against the side of his SUV, staring at the concrete driveway. He had tried to play chess with a master using stolen checkers, and he had just been checkmated in 3 moves. We were trying to avoid court, my mother whispered, tears finally pooling in her eyes. But I knew her tears weren't for me. They were for the lost money. By fabricating his consent? Caleb asked, his tone devoid of any sympathy. That is a fascinating legal strategy, ma'am. I wouldn't recommend bringing it up in front of a judge. Luke kicked the tire of the SUV, breathing hard. The $80,000 was gone. He knew it. I knew it. But his eyes were still fixed on my house. The $600,000 prize was still standing right behind me. The trust gives the beneficiaries a short window to cure the breach, but only if the interference stops immediately, Caleb explained, delivering the final terms. That means the eviction demand is completely withdrawn. No occupancy claim is asserted. No utilities are transferred. No locksmith is retained. And absolutely no one steps onto the property claiming possessory rights. I felt a sudden jolt in my chest. Utilities, I called out from the porch. Caleb looked at me. Your father contacted the local power company yesterday, attempting to establish utility history at this address in Luke's name before the end of the year. The power company refused without deed support. I let out a breath that sounded like a dry sob. They had truly tried everything. They were trying to build a paper trail of Luke living in my house before they even handed me the eviction notice. It was a coordinated, premeditated attack on my life. Luke stared at his father with open, undisguised disgust. You completely botched this. You said this was clean. It would have been clean if he had just behaved. My father snapped, pointing a trembling finger at me. Elijah let out a loud, mocking laugh from the porch. Caleb didn't even blink. There was no version of this that was clean, Robert, Caleb said, closing his briefcase. You are playing with fire, and you are currently covered in gasoline. Luke took a step away from his parents. He looked at Caleb, then looked directly at me. The streetlights cast dark, hollow shadows over his eyes. Grandpa was crazy, Luke said, his voice unervingly calm. And you manipulated him. I'm not letting you steal the family legacy just because you found a sharp lawyer. You think a forged email stops me? I have actual rights. Equitable family occupation. You think you've won, Joshua, but this isn't court. This is a street. Caleb stepped into Luke's line of sight. If you step onto that property claiming possession without a court order, you will be trespassing. The sheriff will remove you. Luke smiled that same terrible, loose smile. We'll see what the sheriff calls it when I'm standing inside the living room. He turned, ignoring his parents entirely, and began walking rapidly down the street, disappearing into the dark. My father swore violently, slammed his fist against the hood of the SUV, and practically shoved my mother into the passenger seat before speeding off. I stood on the porch, the freezing wind biting through my shirt. Caleb walked slowly up the driveway and joined Elijah and me on the steps. He's not done, I said, my teeth chattering from a mixture of cold and adrenaline. No, he isn't, Caleb agreed, his expression grave. He looked me dead in the eye. Listen to me, Joshua. Your brother has crossed into the desperation phase. The trust money is frozen, which means the house is his only target left. Men like him don't retreat when they are caught. They accelerate. What do? I asked. You prepare for a siege, Caleb said bluntly. You need all your security cameras saving footage to the cloud. You need a physical copy of your deed taped to the inside of your front door. You do not open the door to Luke alone. If he has already researched adverse possession, he knows that if he can physically get inside the house and establish a presence before the courts open on Monday, he can make it incredibly difficult for the police to remove him without a formal eviction process. The phrase sat heavily in my chest. Establish a presence before Monday. Before normal people could fix what bad families did on the weekends. He'll try to force his way in? Elijah asked, looking alarmed. He might try a civil standby, Caleb warned. He'll call the police, claim he lives here, claim he's been locked out by a hostile roommate, and ask an officer to stand by while a locksmith forces the door. It's a common tactic for squatters and hostile family members. I have the deed, I said, my voice rising in panic. And he might have a fake lease, Caleb replied. You have to be ready. Part 4.1. The sleepless night, estimated 850 words. I didn't sleep a single second that night. After Caleb drove away, Elijah stayed. We went straight to the kitchen, brewed a pot of the strongest coffee I owned, and turned my dining room table, the same table where the eviction notice had been served hours earlier, into a war room. First, I pulled up the application for my home security cameras on my iPad. I had 3 cameras, one on the front porch, one covering the side alleyway gate, and one facing the back cellar door. I paid the premium subscription fee right then and there to ensure all footage was backed up to the cloud instantly. Second, I dug into my fireproof safe in the office and pulled out the original county stamp transfer on death deed. I made 3 copies. I taped one to the inside of the front door right next to the peephole. I placed another on the kitchen counter, and I kept the third folded in my back pocket. While I was printing the deeds, Elijah was pacing the floor, scrolling aggressively through his phone. Julian, Elijah said suddenly, stopping in the middle of the living room. What about him? I asked, looking up from the printer. Julian is the leak, Elijah confirmed, his face dark. Think about it, Josh. How did your dad know the exact time to send that fake email to the trust? How did Luke know you'd be home alone tonight cooking before I came over? Julian has been grilling you about your schedule for a month. I pulled out my phone and opened my text messages with my cousin. I scrolled back through the last few weeks. Hey man, you still taking those Friday morning Zoom calls from home? Josh, you leaving town for the holiday weekend or staying at the house? Just checking to see if you're around Saturday morning, might drop by. It was all there. I had been feeding them my exact coordinates. They know my schedule, I said, a cold dread washing over me. They know I usually leave the house at 7:30 a.m. on Fridays to hit the gym before work. Tomorrow is Friday, Elijah pointed out, checking his watch. It was already 2 a.m. If Luke is going to make a move to establish presence before the weekend, he's going to do it when he thinks you're backing out of your driveway. I'm not leaving this house, I declared, my jaw clenching. I will sit in the hallway with a baseball bat if I have to. No violence, Elijah warned strictly. That's exactly what they want. If you swing a bat, you go to jail and Luke gets the house. You fight them with paper, cameras, and daylight. We spent the rest of the night sitting in the dark living room, watching the camera feeds on the iPad. The silence of the house was oppressive. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the window panes, made my heart jump into my throat. Around 4 a.m., my mind started playing tricks on me. I kept imagining I could hear the faint scratching of a lockpick at the back door. I kept imagining my father's face, gray and desperate, staring at me through the window. I realized how deeply they had violated my sense of safety. My home was no longer a sanctuary. It was a target. By 6 a.m., the sky outside began to turn a bruised, pale purple. The neighborhood was quiet. The coffee in my mug was cold and bitter. Maybe they gave up, I whispered, my voice raspy from exhaustion. Maybe Caleb scared them off. Elijah shook his head, his eyes glued to the screen. Desperate people don't give up, Josh. They just find sneakier ways to get through the back door. At 7 a.m., the sun fully crested the horizon. I stood up, stretching my stiff muscles. I walked into the kitchen to dump the cold coffee into the sink. At exactly 7:13 a.m., my phone on the counter buzzed violently. A loud, sharp chime echoed through the silent kitchen. It was an alert from the security app. Motion detected, front porch. I dropped my mug into the sink. The shattered porcelain shards scattering across the stainless steel. But I didn't care. I lunged for my phone. Elijah was already beside me, looking over my shoulder at the screen. The live feed from the front porch camera loaded. The image was crystal clear in the crisp morning light. Standing on my front steps was Luke. He was wearing a thick jacket, his hands shoved into his pockets. But he wasn't alone. Luke turned to the deputy and pointed at my front door, talking animatedly. I couldn't hear the audio through the thick glass, but I could read his body language. He was playing the frustrated, locked-out victim. He thinks you left for the gym, Elijah said, his voice tense. He thinks the house is empty. He's going to have the locksmith drill the deadbolt, throw his bags inside, and tell the cop he's home. My blood boiled, the sheer arrogance of it. Standing on my porch with my police department trying to drill my locks. Not today, I growled. I didn't wait for Luke to knock. I didn't wait for the locksmith to touch my door. I grabbed the folded copy of the deed from my back pocket, marched down the hallway, and unlocked the deadbolt with a loud, heavy clack. I threw the front door open. Luke jumped back, startled. His eyes widened in genuine surprise. He had fully expected an empty house. For a split second, the mask slipped, and I saw the panicked calculation of a man whose ambush had just failed. But he recovered quickly. He plastered a fake, relieved smile on his face. Good. You're awake, Luke said, his voice loud enough for the deputy to hear. Man, I lost my keys again. Can you let me in? I didn't look at him. I looked directly at the deputy walking up the steps. Can I help you, officer? I asked loudly and clearly. The deputy stepped forward, looking between me and Luke. Morning, sir. I'm Deputy Samuel. I'm here for a requested civil standby. Your brother here stated he was locked out of his residence and requested an officer present to keep the peace while a locksmith granted him access to his property. Retrieve what property? I asked, keeping my voice dead steady. Luke nudged one of the duffel bags with his boot. My stuff, Joshua. Come on, don't play games in front of the officer. I just need to get back into my room. I looked at the bag, then looked at him. You have never lived here a single day in your life. My mother's voice from the night before echoed in my head. Your brother needs this house. Not a room. The house. Deputy Samuel frowned, his posture stiffening. He looked at Luke. Sir, you stated this was your primary residence. It's a family house, Luke argued, waving a hand dismissively. My grandfather left it to the family. Joshua is just being difficult because we had a disagreement last night. I have a legal right to occupy the downstairs bedroom. Do you own this residence, sir? The deputy asked me directly. Yes, I said. I unfolded the paper in my hand and handed it straight to Deputy Samuel. This is a recorded transfer on death deed from my grandfather, filed and county-stamped before his death. The property taxes are in my name. The homeowner's insurance is in my name. I am the sole, exclusive owner of this property. The deputy took the paper. He read it much faster than I expected, his eyes scanning the legal seals. He handed it back to me and turned to Luke. The neutral posture was gone. He looked annoyed. Do you have a court order granting you access to this property, sir? Deputy Samuel asked Luke. Luke let out a short, condescending laugh. I don't need a court order. I have his written consent. Luke reached into his heavy jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to the deputy with a triumphant smirk. I knew what it was before the deputy even opened it. It was another fake. This is an occupancy agreement, Luke declared loudly, signed by Joshua last month, stating I am allowed to move into the property pending a family transition. The deputy examined the paper. I leaned forward, catching a glimpse of the document. It was typed on cheap, generic legal template language downloaded from the internet. And right at the bottom on the signature line was my name. It was a completely forged signature. It looked absolutely nothing like my handwriting. When was this signed? Deputy Samuel asked, narrowing his eyes at the paper. Last month, Luke lied smoothly. It was not, I said, my voice cutting like ice. That is a forged document. The signature is fake. My father attempted to submit a similar forged document to a trust administrator last night, and I have the lawyer's correspondence to prove it. The locksmith, who had been standing quietly to the side, took one look at my face, one look at the forged deed in my hand, and one look at the highly irritated deputy. The locksmith quietly unhooked his tool bag, stepped backward off the porch, and started walking toward his van. Hey, where are you going? Luke snapped, his facade cracking. The locksmith didn't even turn around. I don't drill locks on disputed properties without a judge's signature. Figure it out yourselves. He got in his van and drove away. Luke swore violently under his breath. The ambush was falling apart. But the nightmare wasn't over, because right at that moment, as I was staring down Luke on my front porch, my phone buzzed in my pocket again. It wasn't the front porch camera this time. It was the side alley camera. I looked down at the glowing screen of my phone. For half a second, my brain simply refused to process what my eyes were seeing. The notification banner clearly read, "Motion detected side alley gate." I tapped the alert, my thumb pressing so hard I thought I might crack the glass. The live feed loaded. It wasn't a stray dog. It wasn't the wind blowing a tree branch. It was my father, Robert Bennett, the man who had raised me, the man who had sat at the head of my Thanksgiving table just 12 hours earlier, was currently creeping down the narrow paved walkway on the blind side of my house. He was hunched over, his collar pulled up against the morning chill, moving with the frantic, jerky urgency of a burglar. In his left hand, he was carrying a large, clear plastic storage tote. In his right hand, the morning sun glinted off something small and metallic. A key. Suddenly, the entire morning made terrifying, crystal-clear sense. Luke showing up at the front door with a locksmith and a fake occupancy agreement wasn't just an ambush. It was a distraction. My father had deliberately sent Luke to the front porch to tie me up, to draw my attention, and to get the police focused on a civil dispute over a forged piece of paper. He knew the locksmith would likely refuse to drill a lock with the homeowner standing right there holding the deed. He didn't care. He just needed me looking out the front window, because while I was arguing with Luke and Deputy Samuel on the porch, my father was slipping through the side gate to break into the cellar door around the back. My whole body went completely ice cold. The sheer, calculated malice of it took my breath away. They weren't just trying to bully me out of the house. They were trying to manufacture physical evidence to steal my inheritance. I didn't hesitate. I shoved the phone screen directly into Deputy Samuel's line of sight. "Deputy," I said, my voice cracking like a whip across the quiet porch, "my father is currently trespassing on my property. He is in my backyard right now trying to break into my cellar." Deputy Samuel looked at the screen. His professional, detached demeanor vanished instantly. He saw a grown man sneaking around the back of a house with a heavy plastic bin and a key. "Sir, stay behind me," the deputy ordered, his hand instinctively dropping to rest on his utility belt. I didn't listen. I was already moving. I cut straight through the house, my heavy boots thudding against the hardwood floors. Elijah was right behind me, sprinting through the kitchen. We burst through the mudroom door, flying down the back steps and hitting the cold, dew-covered grass of the backyard. Luke was shouting something behind us, scrambling to follow, cursing wildly because he knew the plan had just completely imploded. Men like my brother always believed a lie stayed alive longer if they stayed physically close to it, trying to shout over the truth. We rounded the corner of the house just in time. My father was standing right at the base of the old brick cellar steps. The exterior lock on that door had been there since Grandpa Owen's time. I had replaced the front and side door locks immediately after the deed transferred, but I hadn't bothered with the cellar yet because it only held old paint cans, rusted garden tools, and storm supplies. My father had a copied key jammed halfway into the rusted keyhole. He had one foot braced against the bottom stone step, throwing his weight into the door like he was about to muscle it open. The clear plastic tote was sitting on the concrete right beside his leg. "Hey!" Deputy Samuel's voice barked across the yard, carrying the heavy, undeniable weight of law enforcement. "Step away from the door. Right now." My father jolted backward as if he had been struck by lightning. He ripped the key out of the lock, spinning around to face us. His face, already pale from the cold, turned a sickly, translucent shade of white. I'm just retrieving family property," my father stammered, his eyes darting frantically between me, the deputy, and the plastic tote by his feet. "No," I said, stepping forward. My fists clenched so tight my fingernails dug painfully into my palms. "You are not retrieving anything. You are creating it." Luke came skidding around the corner of the house, breathing hard. He stopped dead in his tracks the second he saw my father cornered against the cellar door. He looked at the plastic tote sitting on the concrete. "Dad," Luke hissed, his voice dropping an octave, filled with pure, unfiltered panic. "What are you doing?" I looked down at the clear plastic bin. The evidence of their conspiracy was sitting right there in broad daylight, so painfully obvious it made me want to scream and laugh at the same time. Inside the tote were exactly the things a lawyer would tell you to look for to prove residency. It was a squatter's starter kit. Neatly folded inside the bin were men's clothes, Luke's old college sweatshirts, and a pair of faded jeans. There was a leather shaving kit. There was a cheap, brand-new set of bath towels, still wrapped in the store packaging with the price tag hanging off the side. But the most damning thing was sitting right on top of the clothes. It was a neat, rubber-banded stack of mail. "Look at that," Elijah said from beside me, pointing a steady finger at the bin. "Look at the mail." I took a step closer. The envelopes were pristine. They weren't old, forwarded letters. They were fresh. A credit card offer, a cable television promotion, 2 envelopes from a major bank, a glossy pharmacy flyer, and every single one of them was addressed to Luke Bennett, with my home address printed clearly beneath his name. They were sealed, uncreased, postmarked within the last 5 days. My father had not come back here to collect Luke's belongings. He had come to plant them. He intended to shove that bin into my cellar, take photos of the mail and the clothes inside my house, and present it to a judge on Monday morning to prove that Luke had been living here the entire time. It was a completely fabricated, desperate attempt to establish adverse family occupation. Who owns this residence? Deputy Samuel demanded, stepping between me and my father. I do, I answered firmly, holding up the county-stamped deed again. Do you give this man permission to enter your cellar, or leave these items on your property? The deputy asked, gesturing to the plastic tote. Absolutely not. I want him off my property right now. My father held up his hands, trying to summon the old, authoritative patriarchal voice he had used to control me my entire life. Officer, this is a massive misunderstanding. It's being blown entirely out of proportion. My son Luke has personal effects here. We are just going through a very messy family transition. I'm trying to help him secure his college fund documents and a few other things. Don't lie to my face, sir, Deputy Samuel said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, flat register. You just attempted forced entry on a locked door. Placed here after a civil standby was requested using a forged occupancy agreement. A new, sharp voice cut through the cold morning air. Everyone turned toward the side gate. Caleb Mercer stepped into the backyard. He was wearing the same dark wool coat from the night before, carrying his signature leather folder. He didn't look like a man who had been woken up early. He looked like a predator who had finally cornered his prey. Caleb walked straight up to the deputy and offered a firm nod. Caleb Mercer, Trust Administration Counsel for the Owen Bennett Estate. I represent the legal entity enforcing the forfeiture clauses against these two men. You the attorney she called? Deputy Samuel asked, relaxing his posture just a fraction. I am the attorney her father should have feared, Caleb replied smoothly. Caleb looked down at the clear plastic tote. He let out a dark, humorless chuckle. Well, Robert, I have to admit, I didn't think you'd be foolish enough to try staging the property. But here we are. Caleb pointed his expensive pen directly at the stack of envelopes inside the bin. If your son actually lived here, Robert, those bank statements wouldn't still be sealed. And they certainly wouldn't be sitting in a plastic tub outside a locked cellar. You forwarded his mail to this address this week to manufacture a paper trail. That is mail fraud. On top of the forged signature you emailed my office yesterday. The detail broke whatever fight my father had left. The illusion of control completely shattered. Even Luke looked physically sick. It was too obvious. It was too desperate. There was no spinning this. There was no lying their way out of a police report documenting planted mail, a fake lease, and a copied key. I need identification from everyone present, Deputy Samuel said, pulling a small, black notebook from his breast pocket. My father actually had the nerve to look offended. For what? We haven't done anything. We're leaving. For my official report, the deputy replied, uncapping his pen. Because you attempted unauthorized entry onto a deeded property without lawful possession. You presented a disputed, likely forged occupancy document to law enforcement during a civil standby. And you are standing over a box of staged mail. You are not leaving until I run every single one of your names. Luke tried to cut in, his hands raised in surrender. Officer, wait. I didn't know about the back door. I swear. I was just at the front. My dad told me to wait there with the locksmith. I didn't know he was doing this. It was probably the first true thing Luke had said in 10 years. And it didn't help him at all. It just proved that the golden child would throw his own father under the bus the second things got difficult. Caleb held up a copy of the fake occupancy agreement Luke had handed the deputy on the porch. You brought the forged lease, Luke. You brought the locksmith. You brought the empty duffel bags. Whatever you did or didn't know about the cellar, you were an active participant in an attempted illegal eviction. You were not wandering around accidentally. This is still family, my father shouted, his voice cracking with pure desperation. This is a family dispute. You don't involve the police in family matters. Deputy Samuel looked at my father with the kind of flat, exhausted patience that only years on the force can teach a person. No, sir, the deputy said coldly. This is criminal trespass getting dressed up as Thanksgiving. Hand over your ID. For one glorious, perfect second, nobody in my family had a line ready. There were no excuses. There were no gaslighting arguments about my grandfather's mental state. There were no lectures about my selfishness. There was just the cold, hard reality of law enforcement and a lawyer documenting their crimes in my backyard. And then, just to make the morning complete, my mother appeared at the side gate. I hadn't even realized she had driven over. She must have followed Luke's car from whatever hotel they stayed at the night before. She was wearing her pristine cashmere sweater, her hair perfectly styled, looking entirely out of place standing on the frost-covered grass. She stopped dead when she saw the scene. She saw the deputy writing in his notepad. She saw the plastic tote of staged mail. She saw my father standing away from the cellar door, looking defeated, with the copied key still dangling from his fingers. "Robert?" she asked, her voice wavering, the polite, tidy smile finally nowhere to be found. What happened? Nobody answered her, because by then, it didn't matter what had happened. It only mattered what was being written down in the official county record. Deputy Samuel pulled out his department-issued smartphone. He photographed the plastic tote. He photographed the stack of pristine, sealed mail. He photographed the copied key in my father's hand. He photographed the fake occupancy paper Luke had provided. Finally, I emailed him the high-definition camera stills from my security system, clearly showing my father sneaking around the back of the house while the locksmith was at the front. The deputy took Caleb's card, made a note that the locksmith had formally refused entry due to lack of a court order, and then turned to face my parents and my brother. He made it explicitly clear. "Listen to me very carefully," Deputy Samuel said, his voice echoing off the brick walls of the house. "No one in your family has a legal right to enter this property. You have no right to store property here. You have no right to represent occupancy at this address. If any of you return to this property claiming possession without a signed order from a judge, you will be placed in handcuffs, put in the back of my cruiser, and processed for criminal trespassing. Do you understand me?" My mother opened her mouth to argue, her instinct to rewrite reality still fighting to survive. Caleb beat her to it. "And let me add the financial reality to the deputy's warning," Caleb said, his voice cutting through the morning air like a newly sharpened blade. "If anyone in this family continues interfering with Joshua's title or peaceful possession of this home, I will not wait for a court order. I will recommend immediate, final, irreversible enforcement of the forfeiture clause to the trust board. You will lose every cent Owen Bennett left you, and I will personally refer the forged email you sent my office to the district attorney for fraud investigation." That landed hardest on my father. It hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. Not because he suddenly felt guilty for what he had done to his youngest son. He didn't. He felt sick because he finally understood the trap he had walked into. The security cameras. The forged consent email on the trust server. The fake eviction notice he handed me at dinner. The locksmith. The staged mail. All of it now sat in one clean, undeniable chain of evidence. He had not pressured me into folding. He had handed Caleb Mercer the exact ammunition needed to trigger the penalty clause. He had destroyed his own retirement fund just to feed his older son's bottomless greed. Luke kicked the bottom stone step of the cellar hard enough to hurt himself. He let out a string of vicious curses, turned his back on his parents, and limped heavily toward the driveway, leaving his empty duffel bags sitting on the grass. My mother hesitated. She looked at the ruined plastic tote, then looked at me. She gathered her cashmere coat around her shoulders, trying to salvage whatever microscopic shred of dignity she could still carry. She looked at me with that same small, tight smile she used when she wanted to pretend she was still the one writing the ending to the story. "You'll regret making this so ugly, Joshua," she said softly, her voice dripping with venom. "You tore this family apart over bricks and wood." I looked at the tote of fake mail. I looked at my father's copied key. I looked at the deputy writing their names into a permanent criminal database. "No, Mom," I said, my voice finally calm, devoid of the anger that had carried me through the last 24 hours. "I only regret not installing the cameras sooner. They left. There was no dramatic screaming match. There were no handcuffs. There was no cinematic brawl on the lawn. There was just one failed, pathetic occupation attempt collapsing under the crushing weight of daylight, security footage, and legally binding paperwork." My father picked up the plastic tote, refusing to look me in the eye, and carried it back down the driveway like a man carrying his own heavy casket. I stood in the backyard with Elijah and Caleb as the sound of their car engines faded down the street. The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't the heavy, oppressive silence of waiting for an attack. It was the clean, clear silence of a storm that had finally broken. Deputy Samuel finished his notes, handed me a business card with an incident report number written on the back, and tipped his hat. "You have a good day, sir. Call us if they show their faces on this street again." When the patrol car pulled away, I finally let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for 6 years. My knees suddenly felt like they were made of water. I sat down heavily on the bottom step of the cellar, burying my face in my hands. Elijah sat down right next to me, bumping his shoulder against mine. "You did it, Josh. You held the line." Caleb stood in the grass, checking his watch. "The paper trail is secure. I have the police report number, the forged documents, and the camera footage. I will file the formal suspension conversion first thing Monday morning." "Will they try to fight it?" I asked, looking up. "With what money?" Caleb asked, a rare, genuine smile touching the corners of his mouth. "Your father just lost the trust payout he was banking on to fund a lawyer. No serious attorney in this state will touch a possession theory once they see the civil standby report and the staged mail in the backyard. They are done, Joshua. The fortress held. This is a moment that changed everything, when I finally regained control of my life. Thank you for your patience in getting this far. You are amazing. Please like the video and leave a comment below to let me know you've been with me. This will not only help more people find this story, but also let me know that my experiences are meaningful to someone. Your support is the biggest motivation for me to continue sharing the rest of this journey. The weekend passed in a blur of exhaustion and deep, restorative sleep. I didn't leave the house. I ordered takeout, watched terrible movies with Elijah on the couch, and just let the reality of my new safety wash over me. By Monday morning, Caleb Mercer was a man of his word. He filed the deputy's incident report, the forged occupancy agreement Luke had presented, the email my father had sent with my fake consent, the front porch video footage, and the backyard photos directly with the primary trustee board. Wednesday afternoon, I was sitting at my kitchen island, typing up a report for work, when my phone rang. It was Caleb. The trustee board made a final determination an hour ago. Caleb's voice came through the speaker, crisp and entirely professional. I stopped typing. The only sound in the house was the hum of the refrigerator. "And your father, your mother, and Luke each independently triggered Article 6 of the non-contest clause," Caleb said. "They engaged in direct, documented interference with your lawful possession of the Asheville property. They attempted fraud by forging signatures, and they attempted to manufacture false residency records." I swallowed hard. "So, the suspension is now a permanent revocation," Caleb confirmed. "All remaining distributions from Owen Bennett's trust allocated to Robert, your mother, and Luke are forfeited. Every single penny. They are officially removed as beneficiaries." I sat back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. The same kitchen table where my father had slid the eviction notice beside the potatoes just a few days ago was now the place where I received the news of his absolute defeat. "All of it?" I asked, just needing to hear it one more time. "All of it," Caleb said. "Permanently. Where does the money go?" I asked. I knew Grandpa hadn't left that kind of detail to chance. "Under your grandfather's trust terms, forfeited shares do not circle back to the people who caused the breach, nor do they default to the state," Caleb explained. He built a secondary failsafe. The forfeited funds bypass the immediate family entirely and drop into the alternate remainder he named years ago. Which is a local veterans housing nonprofit here in Buncombe County, and a county library foundation he quietly supported for decades. A check for $240,000 is being cut for them tomorrow. I closed my eyes, a sudden, fierce wave of emotion hitting me so hard it brought tears to my eyes. That detail felt exactly like Grandpa Owen. He hadn't just protected me from the wolves. He had made sure that if the wolves tried to tear down my house anyway, their teeth would shatter, and the prize they were hunting would be given to people who actually needed it. He made sure the money went somewhere useful, instead of back into the hands of a family that only knew how to take. Luke called my phone twice that night. I watched his name flash on the screen, feeling absolutely nothing, and let it go to voicemail. My father sent one single email. The subject line was empty. The body of the email contained only one sentence. You chose paper over blood. I sat at my computer, reading that ridiculous, manipulative sentence. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the urge to explain myself. I didn't feel the crushing weight of guilt they had spent 30 years programming into me. I felt free. I hit reply and typed back exactly one sentence. No, Grandpa did. I just read it. I hit send, and then I permanently blocked his email address. I blocked my mother. I blocked Luke. The next few weeks were entirely dedicated to cleaning up the absolute mess they had left in my life. I called a professional contractor and had the old, rusted cellar door completely ripped out and replaced with a heavy, reinforced steel security door. I added 2 more high-definition cameras to the perimeter, covering every single blind spot. I didn't stop there. The rot in my family wasn't just my parents and my brother. It was the people who enabled them. I drove to Uncle David's house. I didn't knock. I just stood on his front porch, looked him dead in the eye when he opened the door, and told him that if he ever mentioned my house, my name, or my grandfather again, I would personally mail the court records of his messy, ongoing divorce settlement to everyone in his social club. David slammed the door in my face, and I never heard from him again. Then I dealt with my cousin Julian, the spy. Julian texted me a week later, playing dumb, asking if I wanted to grab a beer and watch the football game. I replied with a screenshot of the video showing my father creeping around my side yard, followed by a text that simply said, I know you gave them my schedule. Do not ever contact me again. Julian never replied. Things got quieter in the only way that actually mattered. Legally. No sheriff ever came back to my house. No locksmith ever parked on my curb. No more intimidating lawyer letters arrived in my mailbox. Luke lost the trust money he desperately thought would cushion his next inevitable collapse. Without the 80 grand to pay off his debts, he was forced to finally face the consequences of his own actions. Last I heard through the grapevine, he moved out of state to live on a friend's couch. My father lost the money, but more importantly, he lost his pride. He lost the arrogant confidence that he could simply bully his way through a family problem with fake legal paper and a louder voice. He tried to play the victim, of course. My mother did what she always did. She went to her social clubs, drank her wine, and told people the situation had been terribly misunderstood, and that I had pushed them away. But there is only so much social rewriting you can do once a county deputy has photographed a tote full of planted mail in your youngest son's backyard. The truth always leaves a stain. My neighbors, the people who actually saw the reality of my life, rallied around me. Nathan, the older man who lived across the street, even came over and offered to write a formal witness statement for Caleb, confirming he had never seen Luke live at the house. Ryan, the local mail carrier, gladly signed an affidavit confirming that all mail addressed to Luke had only started arriving the week of Thanksgiving. The community I had built around myself was stronger than the blood I shared with my parents. A full year passed. The seasons changed, the snow melted, and the Asheville summer heat gave way to the crisp, biting wind of another November. I hosted Thanksgiving again. But this time, the table looked very different. The dining room wasn't filled with tension, passive-aggressive comments, or the suffocating weight of family expectations. The chairs weren't occupied by people waiting for me to fail so they could scavenge my life. Instead, Elijah was sitting at the head of the table, carving a massive turkey and telling a terrible joke that had half the room groaning. Caleb Mercer was sitting near the window, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon, arguing good-naturedly with my neighbor Nathan about local politics. The house smelled like roasted garlic, fresh bread, and pine needles. The laughter was loud, genuine, and safe. I looked around the room, taking in the faces of the people who had actually stood by me when the wolves came knocking. Family isn't always the people whose blood runs in your veins. Sometimes, blood is just a biological accident. Real family are the people who help you hold the door shut when the storm is raging outside. Grandpa Owen had known exactly what he was doing. He didn't just leave me a house with 4 walls and a roof. He left me a structure strong enough to survive the people who thought love, pressure, and toxic entitlement were all the exact same thing. He forced me to finally stand up, draw a hard line in the sand, and protect my own peace. He gave me the tools to build a life entirely on my own terms. And as I sat down at my table, surrounded by my real family, I raised my glass to the empty chair in the corner of the living room, knowing Grandpa was watching and knowing he would be proud. If you've made it this far into the story, I want to take a moment to talk about what happened here, because I know I am not the only person who has dealt with this kind of nightmare. The hardest lesson I had to learn, the one that almost cost me my sanity and my home, is that toxic family members will constantly use your empathy against you. They will weaponize your kindness. They will demand that you set yourself on fire just to keep them warm, and when you finally refuse, they will call you the villain. My parents truly believed that because I was the younger, responsible sibling, my hard work was simply a resource for my brother to consume. They wrapped their financial abuse in the language of family unity and fairness. But fairness doesn't mean letting people destroy what you've built. Setting boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of survival. You do not owe your peace of mind, your assets, or your future to people who only view you as a stepping stone. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to walk away, lock the door, and let them face the consequences of their own actions. If the story resonated with you, or if you've ever had to draw a hard line to protect yourself from toxic family, tell me in the comments what lesson you found most valuable here. Or, if you just enjoyed the way this all played out, simply drop the word good in the comments so I know you appreciate the lessons the story brings. Your support means the world to me. Thank you for listening.